This episode is sponsored by a company who has truly found a solution to an age-old problem, and that is Karna bunker gear. One of the most prevalent conversations in the fire service is should we or should we not train in our bunker gear? Now, the answer to both is yes. As most of us are aware, the carcinogens from structure fires, of which there are over 260 that are dangerous to human health, not to mention the PFAS and other chemicals that are within our gear from the manufacturing process, are factors that we obviously want to minimize. Now, the other side of the coin is that we do need to train in our gear. There is no way to acclimatize the heat retention and lack of mobility than to actually wear the gear. So seeing this problem himself, firefighter and exercise physiologist Ryan Conley developed a carcinogen-free gear at a much lower cost that can be used in non-IDLH atmosphere and training that does not require puncture or tear resistance. Now, as someone who always trained in gear myself throughout my career, I wish this technology was around then. And I got to test it personally while coaching my tactical athlete class a few weeks ago, and can testify that it not only simulates the heat retention of frontline gear, but also the lack of mobility, which is imperative at operating at a high level on the fireground. Now, some additional benefits include being able to doff the gear when you do get banged out for a call, increasing the lifespan of your frontline bunker gear, and then also public education. Think of the number of times that we allow, for example, school children to wear our gear when it's infused with all these carcinogens. So there are so many real-world applications for a fraction of the cost of IDLH-rated bunker gear. So if you want to hear the whole story behind this, listen to my conversation with Ryan Conley on episode 1175 of the Behind the Shield podcast, or go to karnabunkergear.com. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name is James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show leadership development professional and the founder of MLS Counsulting, Marcy Levy Shankman. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from her educational journey into the world of philanthropy, leadership in higher education, the fiscal benefits of investing in your people, false economy in the first responder professions, moral courage, revolutionizing the American education system, the importance of refinding our why, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of almost 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Marcy Levy Shankman. Enjoy. Well, Marcy, I want to start by saying two things. Firstly, thank you to our mutual friend, Rick Rochelle, for making this introduction. And secondly, I want to welcome you today onto the Behind the Shield podcast.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. And I was thinking the same about grateful for Rick making the connection.
Yeah, it's amazing how many incredible humans you get to interact with once you start interacting with incredible humans.
Absolutely. I've often said when I make introductions between two people who I'm lucky enough to know, that good people should know good people. And when you start introducing and getting to know good people, it just has a multiplier effect.
Absolutely. Well, very first question, where on planet Earth are we finding you today?
So I am in my home office in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is in the middle west of the United States. We border on Pennsylvania, and a lot of people don't realize that Ohio, while being a Midwestern state, has some inkling towards the East Coast, although it is very much a urban-ish area where I am, because I'm just outside of Cleveland. For the most part, Ohio is more known for farmland.
My wife is originally from North Canton, so not far from you.
Oh, you're kidding. That's
Yeah.
ironic. Fantastic. Yes, North Canton's about an hour if I were to go door to door.
One of the interesting things, and you obviously talk about Pennsylvania, we think of the Pennsylvania Dutch. Talk to me about the Amish population around you, because it's a group of Americans that we really don't hear much about, but obviously you're
Yeah.
surrounded by them.
So they are a very interesting segment of the United States population. I actually also grew up with them around the central Illinois region where I grew up. And I actually have more familiarity with the Amish in Illinois than I do the Pennsylvania Dutch. They are a very traditional community that is anchored in a set of very strongly held beliefs and values. They are incredibly self-sufficient. There's actually an Amish community in Western New York that's not far from here that we have some opportunities to engage with. And the Amish are traditionally aligned with some basic practices of self-sufficiency, like they don't utilize electricity, and they are very focused on farming and using their hands. So craftsmanship and cheese making, for instance, is something that you can count on from the Amish community. So here in Ohio, the community is very well known for making beautiful furniture. And so if you want high quality furniture made from wood, then you're going to look for an Amish carpenter. And they're pretty segmented, isolated, exclusive community. So there tends not to be a lot of social interaction between the Amish and those who are not Amish. And that causes some interesting friction in those geographies.
In what way?
Well, I think that there is a value placed on a certain lifestyle for the Amish that is not consistent with modernity. So the use of technology, the awareness of others, the inclusion of different lifestyles. The Amish are very comfortable with their way of life and their way of being and really set up walls. So when they are your neighbors, I think that creates some difficulty, even in some very basic terms. So if you're driving your automobile on the country highways, you're an Amish community when there's a horse and buggy on the street. And so those are pretty narrow roads, and now you're having to share the road. And in Ohio and Pennsylvania and central Illinois, when we have wicked weather in the winter, it becomes kind of complicated and actually quite dangerous. So that's a really basic small example, but I think you see some social challenges when a family maybe encounters a health challenge and their use of modern medicine. And so there are practitioners of medicine who are saying, we could help you. And there's a resistance or actual rejection of that. And so that can cause some interesting social challenges as well.
It's funny because it's a double-edged sword on both sides of that fence, because if you look at the preventative medicine side, the way that the Amish live actually is the medicine we need to be listening to. But like you said, if you're talking about cutting-edge technology and trauma medicine, for example, then yeah, I'm sure the modern medicine has a lot of value.
Right. Well, and I grew up where we often had the Amish carpenter coming and doing work for us in the house. And I remember just being so appreciative of the work ethic and diligence of high quality craftsmanship. And I think I absorbed some lessons around what does it mean to be expert in something? Because here was this expert in carpentry and workmanship. And that was a tradition that's passed down from generation to generation. And so I haven't really thought about this for years now, but as a young person growing up Jewish in a community that didn't have a very large Jewish community, some of those values I saw consistent with how I was being raised in a Jewish home. And so it's interesting also to think about the diversity in our population and how different communities may appear very different on the outside. And yet, when you get to know them, you realize fundamentally at a values level, they're very similar.
I think that's the
They
problem.
can be simple.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the problem with modern society, I feel, is there's been such overemphasis on pigeonholes and labels and genders and religions and skin colors and, et cetera, that we're missing the majority of what's most important, which is a shared humanity and the celebration of our differences.
Yes, I would agree that there's been an over-indexing on difference and an undervaluing of commonalities.
Going back to the Amish, did you ever see the video that was going around? It was going around social media, so I don't know if it's come across your radar or not, but it was a Tesla behind someone on a horse and cart in an Amish family. And the Tesla was trying to figure out on this little screen what it was, and it kept flashing to all these vehicles, but it was lost. It was completely lost.
Couldn't find it. No, I haven't seen that, but I would find a good laugh out of that one.
Well, a couple of things I think that really struck me about that level of community. Firstly, when you see them building a barn and then they all get together and carry that barn, that is phenomenal. But more recently, I forget which of the storms it was, but some of the storms that affected that area, whilst governing bodies were still trying to figure out who was responsible and pointing fingers at each other, there were a lot of Amish communities that went in and just started building homes for these people that lost theirs, which I thought was beautiful.
Yes, that emphasis on we over me, I think, is very strongly held and demonstrated in those concrete ways.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you mentioned Illinois. Let's start at the very beginning of your journey then. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your parents and your family dynamic.
Okay. So I was born in Ithaca, New York. My father was on the staff and faculty of Cornell University. And we moved at the ripe old age of 1 month old to Champaign, Illinois, because he was hired by the University of Illinois. So I grew up in the Twin Cities known as Champaign-Urbana, otherwise known by those of us who were townies as Shampoo Banana, which probably none of your listeners have ever heard of.
I haven't.
But growing up in Champaign was incredible. So as a child of the 70s, we had the neighborhood where you would go out in the morning as a little person, and at some point you would go home. Certainly to be fed, but perhaps it was to someone else's home for lunch, and then someone else would come to your home for dinner. I actually have very fond memories of knowing it was time to go home when I heard the dinner bell ring, and my mom literally would step outside and ring a bell manually, and you could hear it for blocks. And I think that, this started playing out when I was 7, maybe. So I had a lot of freedom as a child and was very close to a neighbor who was the youngest of 6. And we were just talking about this over-indexing on difference as opposed to valuing commonality. So he grew up youngest of 6, Catholic family, hardworking. His dad owned his own business. I'm one house away. I grew up the youngest of 2. My dad's highly educated. My mom is highly educated. We're affiliated with the university. We're Jewish. And we could not be separated. And so he and I were pretty inseparable from almost literally getting our diapers changed together through high school. And to this day, I still consider him one of my closest friends. We were always running around when we were little. We were really forming our ideas about the world and knowing ourselves and how do we relate to one another through each other's eyes as well as through our own. So when I think about best friends and the value that a best friend holds, I used to always say he was the brother that I wasn't born with. I actually have an older brother who is 3 years older than me. And he and I were not close growing up. We weren't antagonistic towards each other. We just weren't very close. We have become much closer, and we did become much closer towards the end of my high school career. He was in university, and so there was a healthy distance, I think, at that point that allowed us to see the value in one another. But I grew up running around outside, being very active in whatever sport I could be in. I was very much a tomboy, and can actually remember a conversation with my parents at one point, like, why am I a girl? I literally can remember saying that out loud because I wanted to be one of the boys. So I was one of the boys for many, many years, playing tackle football until it was pointed out to me that I would actually get really hurt if I kept playing tackle football. So I was more interested in playing baseball, but then I had to stop playing baseball because at that time, girls didn't play baseball past a certain age. So that's when I switched to fast pitch softball, which actually became the core of my identity in middle school, high school. And in fact, I had dreams and plans of playing fast pitch women's softball in college. Ended up falling in love with an institution that didn't have the sport. So I chose everything else over the athletic identity, which was a huge turning point in my life. But as I said, also raised in a very strongly identified Jewish home. And that was an experience that was quite interesting because we were in the minority. So I went to a high school of about 1,200 kids, and I think there were 4 other Jewish kids in my class. So there was a class of about 300 kids, and I was one of 4 Jews. And I always was raised to be proud of being Jewish. So I learned early on about how do you navigate difference and not have it be something that separates, instead have it be something that brings us together. So I can remember with my best friend going to his house and decorating his Christmas tree. He would come over to our house and he would celebrate one of the nights of Hanukkah with us. And we always had the eternal argument of every December, is it better to get all your presents at once, or is it better to get it spread across 8 days? I don't know that we ever resolved that argument.
You got to have a Jewish parent and a Christian parent, and you can get both.
And then you get both, exactly. So I think what I would say about my childhood was I was raised in a family that supported individuality and fostering a space of learning and growth. Those are words I use now. At the time, I just knew that I was loved and I was cared for, and that I had this incredible community where families looked after their kids and other kids. There was a high value placed on taking care of each other, on supporting each other, and on hard work. We grew up in Central Illinois. There's not a whole lot that's happening outside of the community. And what is happening is reflective of hardworking people. And so while I come from this highly educated family that prioritized always getting an education, there was no question in my mind that I would not only get a college degree, but I would get an advanced degree. I was with kids and really good friends who came from very different backgrounds, whether they came from a farming background or whether they came from what I would call a more blue-collar background. There was this commitment to you do you, and we belong here together. And I realize now what a privilege that was, because clearly that's not what everyone's experience was growing up. And it took going to college when I left Central Illinois to discover, oh, this is not typical. Some might say even that's not normal. But for me, it was very much the norm.
I've said this many times. If you look at the common denominator in most of the holy books of different religions, ultimately you can sum it up with don't be a dick, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Like kindness, compassion, community, empathy, service.
Yeah.
When you hear so many stories, there was a boy, John, that I used to be my neighbor when we go on holiday for a week in England every year. And he was black and I was white, and still am white. And we just saw each other as playmates. It was awesome. And so when you reflected again on these commonalities, there's so many things that bind us together. We truly don't see these differences when we're young. What, through your eyes, are these contributing factors that take these, arguably blank canvases of young boys and girls with I would argue, love and compassion in their hearts predominantly, and create such division as we progress through our years?
Oh, I've thought about this so much. And in fact, I would argue some of what I studied in college was focused on my curiosity as to why does this happen? Why do we not have peace? Why do we have antagonism? Why do we have this emphasis on difference? I think a lot of it has to do with what happens when you become a grown-up. I think there are pressures on adult living that cause people to retrench to that which is common to them or that which is comfortable to them. I think human nature, there is something in our DNA that gets at this. It takes a lot more effort to be together than it does to be apart. You can see this in primatology, where yes, there's a communitarian spirit until there's stress. And when there's stress on the individual or stress on the system, people cling to what is safest for them. And that's that group of people who are closest to you. So it's family and it's the immediate surroundings. I think there are tremendous social pressures, especially today, that are coming from a broader spectrum, even than what I grew up with, because of media and its impact on us, and social media and its impact on us. I don't think it's all evil. I do think, though, there's a greater exposure to negativity. And we know from actually some of the research that's being done in neuroscience that there is greater power in negative emotions impacting the way we believe and think and feel than positive emotions. And so I think there's a little bit of nature that we're fighting against, and there's a lot of nurture that we're fighting against. Because I think you can look at human history, and I'm not the best student of history, but it doesn't take a scholar to know that human history is marked by difference. And so I think I just was reading this morning actually about one of the ways to understand complexity, and complexity science is talking about how the present is integrated with what's come from the past. So there's not this separation between past and present. And I think that speaks volumes as to why there's this overemphasis of difference.
One thing that's glaring about history is it is ripe with lessons, yet we seem to allow the same thing to happen over and over again. And one could argue up until very recently, when there wasn't really any way of disseminating information aside from books and maybe a newspaper, that would be the issue, that a lot of people just didn't realize what was going on behind the curtain. But as we progress through the last few decades, we can't use that excuse anymore. But you still seem to see the same behavior where I would argue a very, very few, manipulate the masses for their own personal gain. Yeah. Why are we allowing that to still happen? And if you were king, queen for a day, what would you do to finally turn the corner on that repetitive cycle?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point and very provocative, particularly for me as I think about the professional identity that I have chosen. If I'm committed to helping people understand their leadership capacity and achieve their potential through that lens of leadership, we have a whole lot of very negative, very destructive, and some even evil examples of what happens when people are in positions of authority, which people often confuse with being equal to leadership. I think we get at this reality that power is easily utilized for negative purposes. And to your point, the impact that one individual can have on the many when they bring together their intelligence with their power, with the use of information and misinformation, it can go sideways real quickly. And so why does that happen? I mean, we could probably go back to Aristotle and Socrates, which I know you've done with some of your other guests. This has been a line of thinking and trying to explore the reasons why for thousands of years. I'm certainly no smarter than those folks, but I think history repeats itself. And unfortunately, human history has a way of repeating really horrible things as much as human history demonstrates that we can rise above it. So I choose to look at how we can rise above. instead of just assume that we're going to be stuck in a pattern of all that other stuff.
I have a theory / hope that the enemy of exactly what we talked about, the tyranny of the few, would be to heal the masses, and understanding generational trauma and how that contributes to all things stress, whether it's financial, whether it's relationship, whether it's, unaddressed, psychological trauma, that if you can get the masses to heal, you then empower critical thinking, which then I think would be the enemy of the tyrant.
I think it's a beautiful dream. And I am of the more optimistic people you will ever meet. And unfortunately, I think you're 100% correct that could happen. And I want to lean on the art. There's some, I'm going to butcher this, but there is, I think it was a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. about the arc of humanity bending towards good. And I believe that. And yet we see examples time and again of, in human history and in our current world, of the few, the tyranny of the few, and that the masses are not galvanizing on the side of good. And so I would love to support your theory and figure out ways. And I think I do, because of how I spend the majority of my work days, is thinking about how to mobilize the masses. I don't do it from a community organizing perspective, but I do work in the spirit of the democratization of ideas and of talents, I would say. And I think that's what we need as well, is for more people to believe that they can have a say in what the future looks like. And they do have power, contrary to perhaps the mass messages that they're receiving.
One thing that seems to be evident, and you could look at Nazi Germany, you could look at many examples of this, but when a nation is deliberately divided, I think you get further and further away from that kindness, compassion community that I believe is human evolution. I think that the way we evolve is closer to kindness. And even if you look at the Bible, I'm not a devout Christian, but I've had this conversation recently. I feel like the Old Testament is, well, here's how not to do it. This didn't work. So here's the kindness, compassion, love, forgiveness, that I think is going to be the future. I think it's a message from the past. But I feel like the people that know what they're doing, if they deliberately keep dividing a nation and pigeonholing them and setting them against each other, they are stopping our emotional progress.
Yes, I would agree. And I think your call back to not only Nazi Germany, but any example of genocide, and in fact, any number of civil wars, you can see how people in those positions of power very deliberately chose routes to divide. It's that old saying, divide and conquer. So if you create those divisions and you reinforce those divisions, you are debilitating individuals' capacity to come together.
Absolutely.
And creating those barriers can be done physically, and we see examples of that today. They can also be created emotionally, psychically, psychologically, economically. So those are a whole lot of environments or arenas for division to be mastered, which makes it, I think, more complicated for how people can choose to come together.
100%. Well, let's kind of start down the road of what you're actually working with now on the leadership side in a lot of the organizations that you work with. From the educational road that you took, it was really interesting. I saw you were in a department based around philanthropy, which I've never seen on an academic level before. So let's start with that. What did that even look like?
Great. I love bringing it into the conversation, because I actually was just on a call last week speaking with someone about the power of that phase of my life. So for your listeners, the word philanthropy is used in a lot of different ways. And I would argue today it's used very narrowly to reflect the practice of giving money. I had the opportunity to work for an individual who was light years ahead of his time. I think he would be known as a Renaissance man. His name is Robert Peyton, who, of blessed memory, made a huge difference in my life. And he made a huge difference in a lot of people's lives. So his role in creating what is called now the School of Philanthropic Studies, I think, at Indiana University. At the time, it was called the Center on Philanthropy when I was a full-time professional working for him and working for that center as an adjacent role. What we were looking at was how do we make ourselves agents of positive change for the good of humanity? And his approach to the work in philanthropy was to broaden people's conception of what does it mean to engage in efforts, whether it is about raising money, or perhaps it's about raising consciousness, perhaps it's about bringing people together, perhaps it's about how you approach education. How do we build into our ways of being, not just in this country, but across the globe, a recognition that our responsibility is not just to ourselves or our communities, it's to all of humanity. So making choices in favor of the common good, for instance, over an individual good was one of his mantras, I would argue. And he had a lot of very pithy ways of communicating. He was a public teacher, and he advocated for all of his students. He had a couple of academic programs that he ran, and then he had a whole lot of what we now call mentoring relationships, where he advocated that we all become public teachers so that we embark on this journey of doing good for the greater whole, no matter what your particular profession or sector was. So he influenced doctors and lawyers and teachers and public servants of any ilk. And generically, he would say, you have the opportunity to do good for others. Leverage that. So whatever your platform is, whether you're a middle school teacher or you're a court-appointed defense attorney, or whatever the role was, you always have a choice where you can do better for the public good, for the common good. And that was really his approach to this word philanthropy. And so I had the privilege of working very closely with him for 2.5 years. And it was an instrumental time of my life. I was in my late 20s. I was working on my Ph.D. At the time, I thought I was going to go into higher education and stay in higher education. And he really challenged me to consider how might I become a public teacher outside of higher education, which is in fact what I have done, keeping one foot sort of in higher ed, but really spending the majority of the last 25 years outside of higher education. Really goes back to my time with him, where he emphasized that if I'm truly committed to this thing called leadership, why am I limiting it to college students? And while college students at the time were my primary source of interest and passion, working with him, I discovered that there is this part of our world called civil society, or the third sector, or the nonprofit sector, or the non-governmental sector. There are a whole lot of labels for it. Regardless of what you want to call it, there are individuals and organizations and systems that are trying to do right by the entire population. So filling in the gaps where government and business are not taking care of the whole, this other large community is focused on how do we take care of the whole. And so that shift of thinking for me was a tremendous paradigm shift, frankly, to move from thinking in a very isolated way about how do I impact the lives of college students in higher education in America to how do I embrace all people who are interested in making a difference in their world through the lens of leadership, no matter where they live, no matter what they do, no matter how old they are. So he really opened up for me and created a much broader view. And we were happily engaged in doing this with people of a whole range, from post-baccalaureate students who were in a fellowship program with him for a year or 2 years to folks in Central and Eastern Europe who were trying to create democratic civil society.
Beautiful. When I discuss higher education, having got my degree in exercise physiology, which is kind of split. I did my first 2 years in London, my last 2 here in Florida. And then my wife has gone through a med school program. I see a lot of the inefficiencies, the unneeded prerequisites, the hyperinflation of the fees for students, et cetera, et cetera. But where is very glaring, ironically, in marketing as well, but in leadership, in my profession of first responders, we have people who pursue pieces of paper, but there doesn't seem to be actual leadership gleaned at the end of that particular track. I would imagine that this mentor that you had kind of witnessed that himself and tried to lean into the altruistic part of leadership that I would argue is the most important part in my profession. What were the disconnects back then that even initiated the program that he started?
So I think one of the disconnects, which is actually where I thought you were going with your own critique of higher education, was that the division between thinking and doing. So one of the disconnects he found was there was no practice of the ideas. There was no practice, putting into the practice the values and the virtues that were being studied. So one of the core components of this baccalaureate program, post-baccalaureate program that he created was that every student would work full-time in a local nonprofit organization, so that whatever they were learning in the classroom, they then had to experience and practice in the work setting. So it's all well and good to talk about collaboration, to talk about service, to talk about values-based decision-making. Those were all elements of the curriculum. It's a whole nother thing to actually do those in a work setting. And the connection that I made, because I was working for him, not taking that curriculum, although because I worked for him, I was taking the curriculum. My own formal curriculum was in higher education and organizational development and organizational behavior, and I was using my filter of leadership, and I saw so much of the principle-based learning that he was advocating, creating the bridge from, well, if you're going to learn it, you've got to do it. And if you've learned it, you're also going to be talking with people about it. So how do you demonstrate in action that which you believe? And I think most programs in any formal educational setting fail to make that leap from what you know and what you think you know to how do you do you. And there's very little practice space provided to students. So skills-based learning in the classroom is often done at best in a laboratory setting, which you and I both know is not real world. And it's better than not practicing at all, but even better is to practice. So I would say he was at the forefront of the internship co-op concept as being integral to a productive education. I think the other disconnect that he addressed was this notion that you mentioned earlier about human history, that we can look at modernity, we can look at current events, and if we don't take into consideration where we have come from, we're really never going to understand modernity. We're not going to understand current events. So it's really important to know the past, to be intelligent about the present, so that we can impact the future. And so I would say that was probably the second major disconnect that he was addressing, was how do we broaden the ways in which we understand today through the lens of the past and through different perspectives on the past. So just as much as he would have someone He would assign a reading, let's say, on one end of the political spectrum. He would assign a reading on the other end of the political spectrum. Or to your point about the holy books, if he's going to be educating about this public servant notion, and where does the notion of service come from? Well, that's from our religious traditions. And rather than just presenting it from a Christian tradition, which is the tendency in this country, because that's the predominant religious orientation, he would bring in alternative views. He would have people read from the Quran. He would have people read from the Buddha or from Confucius or different faith traditions that he thought would be informing this human need and this human capacity to serve others.
I'm glad you used the word service. In my profession, and again, there are some great leaders, true leaders in the fire service, but we are in the absolute midst of a recruitment and retention crisis. And the backstory, I would argue, is when I came on, was very soon after 9/11. A lot of us just signed up and went in blindly. It was very, very competitive, so if you got the opportunity to be hired by a fire department, there were no questions. You just said thank you. Fast forward and you start going to funerals and you start realizing that, the way that we're being worked maybe isn't conducive to a high level of performance and longevity. If that isn't identified and changed, then you start seeing this downward spiral. And where we are now, as we sit here having this conversation today, is there are a lot of people in, and I'm using air quotes, leadership positions who enjoy a 40-hour work week, that go home at 5 o'clock every night and sleep in their family home, whilst the men and women under them are not only working a 56-hour work week, now they're being forced to fill in the gaps, and now they're working 80 plus hours, being forced to stay away from their families. And in those situations, what I see is an absence of moral courage, that just because you are okay, that's not what it's about, that you should be advocating for the people that are under you, that you are representing. And I see a disconnect there. So as you mentioned, you can be in charge, you can be a boss, but to me, a true leader is someone that's going to affect change, even if it doesn't benefit them in any way, shape, or form.
I would say especially when it doesn't benefit them is when you find the most influential demonstrations of leadership and the most effective forms of leadership is when it does have, when that person's moral courage is saying you rise above your own ego and you rise above your own rewards so that you're actually sacrificing for the betterment of all. And it goes to this fundamental definition of philanthropy, the love of humankind, that when you think about those in positions of leadership, and you have examples of how leadership is defined that is aligned to what you're saying. You have just, unfortunately, more examples of just make it to the top and you get all the goods, and then you'll be good at being a leader. And that's the kind of writing around and talking about leadership that just curdles my blood, because that's not leadership. That's the manipulation of power, and that's the use of authority for personal gain. That's not what leadership is. So having had the privilege of working with some folks in the fire service, I was really struck by the unwavering commitment to improve the lives of others. And this was the first population of individuals who I had the privilege of working with who literally were putting their lives on the line, because that's what it means to be a first responder, is that you are literally willing to sacrifice your life for someone else. And I couldn't help but think that during the couple of days that I spent with these two teams in the fire service, that there are no better examples of what a commitment to leadership looks like than in the fire service. Now, whether it's the practice or not is what you're saying, that in the practice of leadership, you see the difference between those who are taking advantage of their positions of power and authority and those who are leveraging them for the good that can come. You see this in lots of other sectors, but I think it's particularly stark and frankly painful in the fire service, because of the stress and of the pain that people are experiencing in their fulfillment of what they see as their calling. So the need for effective leadership, I think, is even greater in the first responder community.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, I feel it's exactly that. It exasperates the chasm, because when we first toe the line at the beginning, selfless, courageous service is exactly what our entire ethos is. So then when you have the abandonment of that as someone maybe climbs a particular career ladder, that is the ultimate organizational betrayal, which, ironically, as we're learning now from psychology, is incredibly detrimental to the mental health of the people that serve under you.
Right, right. And I think it's not difficult to also say, by extension, you're really damaging the organization's health. So it's an interesting perspective to take. What is it in human nature that causes us to work against our own self-interest and the betterment of the whole? And yet there are so many examples of people doing that.
So you're in this academic space. What was some of the first organizations or institutions that you started working with as a mentor now?
Do you mean from when I was at the Center on Philanthropy, or more recently? At what point in my career are you thinking?
Yeah, but I mean, once you started kind of reaching out of actually being the student yourself, where was some of the first kind of professions or organizations that you started impacting?
So I think early on, because my focus started out as the ways in which we can impact young people as they go through their higher education experience, I started out in a very traditional sense, identifying institutions of higher learning, so colleges and universities that were committed to the healthy development of their young people. And frankly, that's why I went and got a Ph.D., was because I wanted to be a part of the change that would help colleges and universities remember and prioritize the healthy growth and development of young people. Because if we're not fostering their growth, then what's the point of a college or a university? I think that question is particularly relevant today, frankly, because it's become more of a business than a calling. But at the time, back when I first was at the outset of my career, I would say I was very much within the walls of higher education. So I was working at different colleges and universities, and I was starting then to see that there were a lot of organizations that were adjacent to colleges and universities. So when we think about the activities that students are involved in on campus, I started to work with athletic organizations, and I started to work with fraternities and sororities, and I started to work with service organizations that had membership of college students. So trying to help them figure out their best ways of cultivating the talent of young people and designing systems and structures that would be supportive of their healthy growth and development. Because again, I think the pressure to run a business, no matter what your mission statement says or no matter what your vision is, there are some unfortunate forces that I think come into play when you realize, oh, we've got a good thing started, but now in order to stay afloat, we have to build the business. Well, as soon as you start prioritizing numbers over people, that's always when I get concerned. So I was trying to work with organizations that were in support of the higher education system. And then while I was working at the Center on Philanthropy, that's when I started to see, oh, wait a minute, if I'm doing all of this on the college campus and with organizations that are coming onto the college campus, why aren't I doing this for the broader community, called the nonprofit sector, called those organizations that are mission-driven and fueled by the passion of those working in the organizations, but those individuals often are lacking in understanding, well, what does it take to lead an organization? How do you change the minds of others? How do you galvanize a community around a particular calling that you feel your organization is here to sponsor? So if you're trying to end homelessness, there's a very powerful community of individuals who are passionate about ending homelessness they may not have the skill set to influence others, which is inherently what leadership is about. So I started to then broaden out into the nonprofit sector. And I would say, James, I spent about 20 years almost exclusively spending my professional working hours, whatever they may be, morning, noon, night, weekends, holidays, between higher education and the nonprofit sector. And it's only very recently that I've realized and had the opportunity to extend then into the public sector and government as well as business. So it's been kind of starting with the higher education space, nonprofit space, then into some of those other spaces.
I want to go to the nonprofit space because that in itself is a very interesting area. But just before we do, I saw this on social media, so I'm taking it with a pinch of salt, but I saw something saying that I think it was as late as the 80s, a student could work during the summer and earn enough money for them to pay for college for the rest of the year. My wife just graduated med school with almost $1 million worth of debt this last year. Big difference between those two statements. And obviously med school is always going to be a little bit more. What have we seen as far as the devolution of the affordability of education for, our future workforce?
Yeah. Well, you cannot mathematically make it work as an undergraduate student today to work your way through college. And I think it maybe is even as late as the early 90s. You could still work your way through college. And now the price of higher education has gone beyond an individual's earning capacity, so that the equation inherently puts you in debt if you don't come from a family of privilege who had set up the 529 plan when you were born so that you could afford college. I want to say that, don't quote me on this, so maybe this is something that you won't include, but I want to say that the average price of a traditional 4-year degree is no less than $800,000. And students can't earn that. A traditional age student or a non-traditional age student cannot earn that. So yes, med school is above and beyond. The 4-year degree itself has moved out of reach of the majority of the student population. Thank goodness we have the community college system, where not only 2-year associate's degrees are offered, but tremendously powerful job certification programs are happening, as well as some 4-year degrees are being offered at community colleges, which remain the most accessible and the most affordable. So students still can work during the summer and the school year and afford a 2-year degree or one of those certification programs. But the traditional bachelor's degree is out of reach.
Yeah,
and I think there's a reckoning coming for higher education.
My son's he was going to go to Utah State. He got accepted, but again, on paper, it just made no sense. So he's doing his first 2 years here, still living at home, going to community college. Mm-hmm. And then, he's going to do the second 2 in Utah, which
the transfer.
Yeah, and it's actually a very inexpensive school compared to, I went to University of Florida, insane. Like you said, mm-hmm. my degree was $60,000. So absolutely lunacy. But yeah, so there are ways of making it more efficient. But I mean, it seems to me that firstly, you have these prerequisites that make no sense. The number of high-level math classes my wife had to do to be an optometrist was complete lunacy. I mean, she's not, sending people to the moon. She's checking your eyes. This is a lot more anatomy and physiology than high-level physics. But then, the like you said, just the price. I mean, there's got to be fewer and fewer sections of society that are able to get this education. So from a wasted resource of some of these prereqs that I think trade schools do a very good job eliminating is one conversation, but also, and I'd love to get your thought on this, where did this come from? How do we get from, a lot of the places around the world give their nation free education, India, for example, if I'm not mistaken, and yet we have probably the most expensive education system on the planet. Mm-hmm.
It's a great question. I think there was a time when I would have been able to answer that question, but I've been so removed from the study of higher education. What I would say is I think you could extrapolate and say, just like so many other systems in our country have become tremendously focused on economics. And the viability of an entity has gone beyond its original design. And so I think if we were to look at the roots of higher education, where, granted, originally only the privileged few could attend, and you had to be in the higher class, the upper class, in order to attend Socrates' seminars, right? When Socrates gathered people, he was not gathering people from across the community. He was gathering the most wealthy and the most privileged. And so in some ways, you could say, well, actually, higher education is the same today as it was then. It's only for the privileged few, but we've created a business that has provided this camouflage of it's available to everyone. I think that oversimplifies. I think there was an incredibly important time in the United States with the GI Bill, for instance, where government took a very deliberate step to create access to higher education. And then it was affordable. And then literally anyone could attend a 4-year degree granting institution, and they could make it through that 4-year degree granting institution, even if they didn't come from money. So I would say instead of it being a straight line from ancient Greece, it's been more of a roller coaster of experiences around access and affordability. I think that ongoing challenge today is that while someone might get into school, might get into a college or a university, they can't afford to stay in. So you look at the compounding pressures of the reducing population, because we actually have a population of college-going students that is lower than what it used to be. So the system is designed for more people than who currently can get there, or literally could get there. And then when you add the economic challenges on top, that's even fewer people. So we have too many colleges and universities for the population as it's currently designed. So we're creating new pathways. More and more institutions have opportunities for adults to return to get their bachelor's degree. In theory, they've created mechanisms like giving academic credit for work experience. So to your point, maybe you're 10 years into your career and you decide you want to go back and get your 4-year degree. There are some institutions that now will give you a pass on some of those prerequisites because you've demonstrated in the workplace. But those are not sufficient to address the financial challenges. So we have a financial model of an organization or of a system that just isn't sustainable in the long run. And I think we have institutional leadership, frankly, that is losing touch with the purpose of higher education. So as higher ed has become a bigger business, we're starting to now see people in positions of leadership at those colleges and universities who actually don't understand the history of higher education. And they are coming at running an institution with a business mindset, which actually doesn't work for the educational principles of the institution. It may work for the financial needs of the institution, but it's going to be now at cross purposes with, why does this institution exist? What is the purpose of higher education? It's actually not to make money. Yet, today, most leaders would say that's what my responsibility is to make sure this institution stays financially afloat. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I did get to go on a soapbox a little bit.
No, it did. It did. It's interesting. I think it was the Washington Post, well, no, the Wall Street Journal did a piece probably about 6 months ago now, and it was saying that Gen Z is leaning into the trades more so now than ever. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about the recruitment crisis, when I used to Google 20 years ago or Ask Jeeves or whatever it was back then, firefighting, it was like, it's all heroes and babies and, mustaches, and that was it, and there's maybe some guides on how to ace your interview, and that was about all you could find. Now, if you Google is it healthy to be a firefighter? Are you going to have page upon page upon page on cancers and suicides and all the things? And it's not detracting
Right.
from the actual position and the service and all the beautiful things, but now we get to see both sides. And I think this is what's happening with higher education too. If someone Googles, is it worth getting a degree?
Right.
You know, they're going to get the honest answer. Well, hey, it's going to be tens of thousands of dollars. You get a piece of paper and it probably won't guarantee a job. Is it worthwhile being a welder or a plumber or a carpenter? Yes, you're pretty much going to be able to work the moment you get that piece of paper. So from my profession, if we don't fix the things that are broken, young people won't want to come to be firefighters anymore because they Google all the bad things. And it's the same, I think, with higher education as a good parallel. You know, like Blockbuster, if you don't change the way you do things when you realize the writing's on the wall, you're going to collapse.
Right. Right. Well, and I think the other thing that's really interesting, at least in terms of threats to higher education, is you could also make the argument that you can learn just as much through the internet.
Yep.
And there are free courses now being offered by various individuals and institutions that are provided at your fingertips through your machine. Some of them are free, and even those that cost money cost less. So why would I go to and I know the community colleges are also fighting this as well. Why go to the community college for a technical course on Excel when I can go into any number of providers online and do that same course for a quarter of the price? So the community college is being threatened now in ways that it hasn't been in the past. And the four-year institution is being threatened from all different dimensions, including, is it worth it? So do I really want to go in debt for $800,000 or $1 million? What's the value proposition of higher education? And to your point, firefighting, I know folks who are in the police forces are finding the same challenges with recruiting. You know, look at all of these negatives, look at all of these risks. Why would I want to go into that? So recruitment is a huge challenge.
So where do you see, with this kind of, lens that you have now in 2026 and all these different organizations that you work with, where is the resistance to change when you know that the way that you've done things aren't working? And I'm very blunt, our graveyards are full of data on how not to do it. Why do we find so much resistance? And I can testify to this personally. The amount of pushback I've had when I've created so many, let's say I've found so many people that have the solutions, brought them onto the show, shared papers. I mean, all these different things, put it on a silver platter for $0. And there's still so much pushback, shown where the money is downstream with the wasted overtime and lack of retention and workman's comp premiums and lawsuits from mistakes. And there's still so much resistance. Where is that coming from when you could empower someone to be the hero in their department if they had the moral courage to just simply say, this isn't working, we need to do something different? And those guys over there have already got the answer for us.
So this is when I wish I had studied psychology, because I think I would have a firmer foundation. What I can share with you is from my experiences and the ways in which I've gone about working with people, because this is a constant refrain that I'm hearing, which is, why are people so resistant to change? If only we could get people to do this instead of this, we would be so much better off. I will say that there are some fabulous ways of understanding why humans resist change. And one of my gurus around change, or the challenges of change, is William Bridges, who talks about how change actually brings about grief. Because if you're changing, that means you're saying goodbye to something, or you're losing access to something. And so grief causes pain. So why choose a route that causes pain? And this is when I then look at the economists who say we are not rational actors. I had this fabulous conversation with my son who majored in economics. He didn't love majoring in it, and I said, okay, so then what would you major in now? He's 2 years out from his college experience. He's like, economics. And I said, well, but why is that? He said, because everyone should understand what economics is teaching. And one of the principles that he has helped me remember from my one economics course, which, by the way, was a total disaster in my academic career. But what he talked about is how economics is great at rationalizing the expected. But we as human beings are not rational beings. And so we don't make rational choices. So to your point, there's all sorts of data and there's all sorts of evidence that a particular course of action is not the right course of action. And yet time and again, we choose that course of action and we get all of those costs and all of those consequences, when if we had only been willing to change and try something different. But I think what gets in the way so often is fear. I think people are afraid of doing something different. They're afraid of what the consequences could be if they try to go against the norm. And so we have this tendency as human beings, I think, to stay with what's comfortable, even when we know it's not working. And I think about this on a very just human level of how many people do you and I know who are in jobs that are not good for them? They're not happy in them. They're not fulfilled by them. They are maybe being harmed by them, to your point, from either a mental or a physical perspective. And yet, so many people are resistant to changing their jobs. Why? Well, because change is hard. Change is scary. Change is uncomfortable. And so better to know, what is it? Better to... what is that saying?
The devil,
you know is better than the devil you don't know. Thank you. I needed that. Because we can use the other cliche, the grass isn't always greener on the other side. And so I think people are afraid, frankly. So when I think about why people don't change, I actually go to the Pixar movie Inside Out. Have you seen it?
I have. Great film.
Okay. One of my favorite films always. And I feel like it should be required viewing for every human being at various points of their lives. Like you should rewatch it. And I just think about those base emotions, fear and anger, they keep us from doing a lot of really good things. Sadness, same thing. I'm not saying those are always bad emotions. We have good reasons to feel those emotions. I think, lean into the comfort of what isn't working out of fear of trying something new, because what if it doesn't work also? Then we're just back where we started. So it's that you've extended all that effort for nothing. And so I think there is this unfortunate pessimism that kicks into people's minds when they think about change. And they see the bad stuff. So you've been quoting social media. I'm not a big user of social media, but I'm trying to do more of it, which you probably don't hear very many people say. But I feel like sometimes I'm missing what's going on in the world around me because I'm not on social media enough. So I'm trying to be there more. And I saw this great meme that said, if we can overanalyze what goes wrong in our lives, why don't we overanalyze what goes well or what goes right? But I think we have a human tendency to focus on the negative, which is why people don't change. That's oversimplifying it.
There's a quote I heard someone say quite a while ago now, and it's spot on. And it's choose your hard. So if you use being overweight, for example, yes, going to the gym is hard. Yes, making certain dietary changes is hard. But carrying around 50 pounds of weight all day, every day is also hard. So once you acknowledge either way is going to be hard, why not do the thing that's hard that's then going to benefit you? And you're going to have this, healthier, life, and you're going to be able to play with your kids, and you're going to have longevity. And the same with these courageous decisions that are needed to turn the ship around in the first responder professions. Yes, it's going to be a hard conversation to go to your city or county and say, look, downstream, here's all this money we're wasting. We can't get people to test for us. We're losing people through suicide and cancer and all the other things. That is a hard conversation initially to put yourself out there and sell it.
Right.
But it's also hard. I would hope it was hard, if you truly have a heart, to stand up at a pulpit in a funeral and deliver some sort of speech about why another one of your first responders just died, or why a family died in your community because the fire engine that should have been there wasn't fully staffed. So in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion, I mean, I agree with you 100%, but it's a position of courage. When, if you're going to be
Yes.
wearing that Class A uniform with all those bugles on your, on your collar, you are expected to be courageous the same way as me when I was simply a firefighter. I was expected to go into that burning building. And so
Mm-hmm.
you have to have the courage to be able to make those hard decisions.
I can't help but think to one of the foundational texts that shapes how I think about leadership and how I work with people when it comes to this question of how can I be more effective in leading. And it's work by Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky on adaptive leadership. And the subtitle of one of their books is something like The Dangers of Leading. And I think it's because, and they write about this in the book, and I think it's very powerful when you have a position of authority. And by the way, they talk about the difference between authority and leadership. And this is one of the reasons why I think so many of our organizations and institutions are in such bad shape, is because people collude. There's a confluence of authority and leadership, and people don't understand the difference. And so I think what often happens is people get into those positions of power and then realize, oh, this is going to be really hard. So to your point of choosing hard, they choose the easy way rather than the courageous way of standing up for what's right, let's say from an ethical standpoint. Because it's harder to do that, they opt out, or they choose to hope that the bad thing won't happen because it's easier. And so I like that saying, choose your hard, because I think a lot of people are looking for what's easy. And the reality is leadership is not easy. And yet there is this mythical sense that, oh, if you get to that position, life gets easier. You don't work as many hours. Your life isn't at risk. You get to make decisions. All these ideals come to mind, when in reality, the virtue of leading is that you make hard decisions. And ideally, if you're demonstrating ethical, influential, effective leadership, those decisions are not based on what is easiest for you. As you said earlier, you have to have the moral courage to make the decision on the principles of the organization, the values of the organization or of the profession, for what's better for everybody, what's good for the whole, which goes back to my old mentor's view around philanthropy. So it sort of comes full circle. And I think this is true whether you're in the fire service or you're in higher education or you're running your own family business. One of my clients tells stories of what their experience was like running a family business and how convoluted it got because people in positions of authority made decisions that were not best for the business or the clients. They chose to do what was best for them, and what was best for them ended up running the business into the ground, which ultimately they knew was going to happen, but they couldn't make the hard choice. So they chose the easy route, which then led to the worst outcome.
We know there's pretty much three groups, I would argue, in most scenarios. So for example, in the fire service, you're going to have, let's say at my level, you're going to have the firefighters that, despite the environment and the work hours and all those other things, they're still going to focus on trying to sleep, trying to eat well, exercising, training, taking extra classes. That's your top 10%, if you like. And the numbers obviously are I'm just throwing numbers out there. You have the bottom 10% who really just showed up for a paycheck and that was about it. And they're going to do the bare minimum. But to be compassionate, I would say that you've got a middle group of whatever that ends up being, 80%, 60%, whatever we want to label it as, that can really kind of be swayed either way. So in the leadership point of view, in the first responder professions, you're going to have those incredible thought leaders that are morally courageous, that are the people that we're trying to model everyone else on in the fire service. You're going to have the equal and opposite, that doesn't matter how many people they lose, they still sleep soundly in their beds, I would argue, borderline sociopaths. And then you have the middle group. So
yeah.
knowing the elasticity of that group, what would you bring to these leaders through, your kind of leadership principles and philosophies to break the inertia and move them towards the moral courage of making those hard decisions?
Well, I think I'll go back to our initial connector, Rick Rochelle and Rob Nielsen, who run All American Leadership, which provides leadership training in the fire service. And a core component of that curriculum, which is in alignment with how I have always run my business, is values-based decision-making and ensuring alignment from the individual through the team to the organization on a values basis. So whether you're in the fire service or whether you're in a business, or doesn't matter, in a hospital setting or in the neighborhood, I think the capacity of an individual to understand what matters most and for what reason is how I think about the values basis of how we live and lead in our lives. And without a lack of clarity about what matters most, and without a lack of alignment of what matters most with how we conduct our lives, I would argue that's the fundamental truth of where we either go right or we go wrong. So having the moral courage, to me, comes down to, do you live in alignment with your values? I was involved with an organization, James, for many, many years called the Leadership Institute, and it still exists today. It is a 6-day immersive leadership program for college students, trying to help them learn how to live and lead with integrity. And what I loved about that experience, and it was fundamentally transformative for me as a staff member, was this recognition that in our daily lives, we have to choose to pay attention to our values. We all have our values. The question is, are you explicitly living with them, or are they implicitly in your lives? And I think the more we can explicitly live with our values at the forefront of who we are and how we interact in the world, the more effective we can be. So if I'm thinking about those organizational leaders in the fire service, my hope would be that there is an opportunity for them to consistently and continuously keep the values at the forefront of their minds, rather than to have those values almost become like the air we breathe, where we're not thinking about it. Although the irony is, in the fire service, you think about air a lot because you often don't have access to good air. But just in the everyday way of understanding, it's like the fish who's swimming in water and isn't conscious of the water. We can be not conscious of our values. And I think that's when we run into the biggest problems, is when people aren't operating from a core values basis. So I have worked with many, many individuals and groups over the years around values clarification and being conscious of your values, and have been pushed on, well, what do you mean by values? Because I value money. Well, that's not a core value. Why is money important to you? Well, then you get at what the core value is. The core value is security. The core value may be stability. The core value may be love. But is it money for you, or is it money for others? And then you start discerning what is the demonstration of that value. And I think if we had a way to consistently and explicitly ensure that people in positions of authority are understanding what their values are and are operating in a way that's aligned with organizational values, we would see different outcomes.
That's a good segue to the nonprofit space. You have a lot of people initially that, I would argue are beginning this journey of, whatever their nonprofit is, for the right reasons, for that philanthropy, for that altruism. Fast forward however many years, we hear stories of these large nonprofits that have these insane administrative costs, and they're taking themselves on holidays and all kinds of things. So there's clearly a disconnect at that point. What are you seeing as far as that space, and where is that balance between obviously needing some sort of financial stability, but not letting go of the primary goal of a nonprofit?
It's an interesting challenge because I think, to your point, there is a rare example of someone who gets into the nonprofit sector who isn't coming from a motivation of kindness, compassion, care, love, understanding, virtue. I wonder if there isn't a similar progression that we actually talked about earlier in relation to higher education, that economic and financial realities start to overtake that values basis or those core motivations that started out as this is our why, and that down the road what ends up happening as organizations expand or go to scale, whatever the term is that you want to use, people lose sight of their why. And one of the compelling exercises that I have done actually comes from, I think, Jim Collins, who talks about the 5 whys as a way to remind someone of what is that motivation. I would hazard a guess that when we see malfeasance or mismanagement in the nonprofit sector, it's often because someone has lost sight of their why. And that happens through time. It happens as people gain power, because we know that power corrupts, and people lose sight of what the impact of their actions and words can be on others when they get distanced from the problem. So Brian Stevenson talks about being proximal to the problem, being proximate to that cause which is motivating you. If you're not familiar with Brian Stevenson, he's behind the Equal Justice Institute and has done, is a defense attorney for those fighting the death penalty. That's part of his history. And what has become a very strong mantra in the nonprofit community has been around, how do we make sure that we are proximate to the problem? Meaning, if we get far away from our cause, then it's really easy to lose sight of priorities. And then your decision making can get shifted into, let's say, what is good for me versus what is good for our cause. When we have distance from problems, it's easier to lose sight of, why am I here in the first place?
It's interesting because there's a huge parallel. For example, in this recruitment crisis that we see now, there's a leaning into just filling seats. Now, an 18-year-old doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to be an effective first responder. You're just a human body sitting in that seat. And so I feel that this, exactly like you said, there's a disconnect of the why. Well, why are we sending a vehicle full of 3-4, expert fire and EMS personnel to this building that's on fire, to this medical emergency? Well, the goal is to obviously be as effective as possible and save a life. The moment that's lost in the fact of just numbers, well, how many people do we need to fill this engine? How much is the salary? Okay, here we go. I think this is how we ended up with this problem now. And then locally, just to use this as an example, not only the county where I live, if they had 5 suicides in the last 5 years, they just had 4 firefighters arrested on a hazing, which resulted so far in 10 terminations. So you filled those seats with this, bottom of the barrel hiring. And I'm not saying that everyone there is bottom of the barrel. Let me be very clear. There's some great firefighters and leaders. Well, I wouldn't say leaders so much, but great firefighters in this profession. But when it comes to the philosophy in this toxic environment, this is your downstream cost again. So is the mission being fulfilled at the moment? I would argue no, because there are all these issues that are costing myself, the taxpayer, millions of dollars now through all this lack of, jobs and the lawsuits that I'm sure I'm going to follow through wrongful termination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I see where we have these fire departments that are not acknowledging where they need to change is exactly like you're talking about. The people at the helm, whether it's county or city commissioners, whether it's fire chiefs, whether it's union presidents, they have completely lost the why, the very core of what we're there to do in the first place.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you say that, because I've been spending more time with executive leaders these days. And I have found that this conversation around why is one in which that often catches them off guard. Like, wait a minute, what are you asking me? Because the pressures that they're living with on the day-to-day pull them away from that space. So I try to remember the kindness, the compassion, the empathy in my work with them, to learn what does it take to be in that position of leadership. And at that executive level, you're dealing with so many stresses and strains that are seemingly urgent and important. But we know from any number of sources that when your attention is only on the urgent, then you often miss what's important. And the urgent can take so much of your energy and your bandwidth that when it comes to making those important decisions, you're taxed. Like you have nothing left in the tank because you've been constantly addressing those urgent issues. I have to say, as an aside, if I was talking to someone else, I would use the analogy of you're constantly putting out fires as opposed to dealing with what's the core issue. But I can't use that analogy with you. Although I will share, I heard a really brilliant perspective that comes from fire service around executive leadership and decision-making that says, there are embers that do not need oxygen. So don't blow on those embers. Let them die out. What you actually need to pay attention to are these upstream issues. And so they use the fire service as an analogy of resource allocation of the leader's time, attention, and insight. And that too often they are in a firefighting mode as opposed to a prevention or preparing mode. And so I thought that was an interesting perspective to take, because I do think that the fire chief, the city commissioner, even captains can get caught up in those demands of the paperwork and the regulations and the compliance issues. And those are all urgent because you have to meet those deadlines. When in fact, the important work is the human development. It is making sure there's a sense of team because you have to depend on each other when that call comes in and the engine goes out. Like, it's everything to appreciate about how coordinated a team is when it comes to fighting a fire. I have learned that through this experience with All American Leadership. There's no better example, I don't think, of effective teamwork when it comes to looking at humans working in concert with each other. Unfortunately, that's not the urgent work of those in leadership. But it has to become the priority work because that's the important work. How do you train people to work in concert with each other? But those aren't the deadlines that people in those positions of leadership, I think, they're not feeling that pressure in the same way.
What about the financial benefits of investing in your greatest asset, which is the people that work under you? When I swear almost every single conversation I have when there's an issue, one of the most obvious factors is the false economy, and again, like I just detailed with locally here, trying not to make those changes, add the extra personnel, attract, great firefighter recruits to then fill the vacancies and then have a full platoon, fully staffed, healthy shift that gets ample rest and recovery, that can go home with their family and, really bolster their relationships. Downstream, you would save the taxpayer millions. But
yes,
what I see over and over again is a lot of poor leaders, rather than understanding, the proactive investment of their people, they just lean into the false economy of, well, I just want to look good this budget
Yeah,
year. I don't want to rock the boat.
absolutely.
So talk to me, because you've obviously worked with a lot of groups now. What are you seeing overall? I mean, not just numbers, but just in principles of the downstream financial savings of prioritizing the health of your people?
Well, I wish I had those numbers. I literally was just talking with someone yesterday about how having those numbers would be so beneficial, because for whatever reason, it seems like numbers convince people better than principles, which I still don't understand. But that seems to be the currency: is you got to prove it with the data. And there are organizations like Korn Ferry and Deloitte and the Center for Creative Leadership. There are any number of organizations, the Gallup organization, who study this downstream impact of training and effective hiring, effective onboarding, and the money that's saved. So I want to say it's something like, so I'm going to say this one number and then shift to the principles. I think the number is something like you save 6 times the investment in training. Like if you train someone well, your savings are 6x over poor training, which then leads to all of those negative consequences like high rates of turnover, absenteeism, poor performance, etc. I think the principles that I lean into when I am working with individuals and organizations on this investment question is, one principle is, well, what do you want? Like, how do you want to go to work every day? What kind of work environment do you want to be in? And so the principle of, frankly, what would I call it? It's not self-protection, but it's essentially, when you think about what you want to experience at work, describe that environment for me. And the environment or the organizational culture that someone describes, I can very easily tie to that comes about through good training. And it even comes about through good hiring practices, which is all about creating the pipeline. So I can go upstream with that individual to say, if this is what you want your daily or organizational existence to feel like, to look like, to be like, let's go upstream and look at how you get there. And it is all about talent development. And talent development starts with your hiring practices, which actually comes from developing the pipeline for people. But just because you hire them in doesn't mean that you can then just wash your hands of it and say, okay, good people are here, now we can let them be. No, it actually takes deliberate, intentional cultivation of a way of being, of a way of working, of bringing those shared values into the workplace. I think one of the practices that I've always believed in mattering the most, which frankly the fire service has the perfect opportunity to embody, because you actually have to do this, which is to break bread. It's to eat together. Because when you actually share a meal with the people who you work with, you create bonds. And there's all sorts of neuroscience behind this that talks about the different hormones that fire off when you feel a sense of belonging, when you feel seen and heard and valued, when you learn about one another's lives and you create a trusting environment, you get this thing called psychological safety. Well, this is best built around a table eating together. And the fire service, that's part of your shift. There are a lot of organizations that really struggle with how do we break bread together. So I'm trying to create ways for my clients to do that, which I think is at the fingertips of leaders in the fire service. So the principle of coming together to know one another, to create those social and psychological bonds with each other, is one of those investments that doesn't take necessarily a whole lot of time or even a whole lot of money, but it does take intentionality. So you can't just sit down and have food. Being able to have some kind of purpose in that gathering and having a moment to say, so what's gone well with us, our day today? Where did we do really well last week? How do we celebrate together? That also counteracts the negativity and builds the positive regard you have for your teammates, whether you're in the fire service or whether you're in the office. How do we celebrate together our accomplishments? I would argue is almost a lost art of leadership, lost art of management. It's what we have to fix the problems. It's always a deficit-based thinking approach. And I would say if we instead had managers and leaders approach their work with others from an asset-based perspective, we would see remarkable changes.
I love that philosophy that you had, that imagine where you want to be and then reverse engineer from there. Because if I really am, blatantly honest about all the places I work, which had the best culture, it would be Anaheim in California. And at the time, we weren't really talking about the kind of work week and stuff back then, but the hiring was incredibly competitive. It was, again, a few years after 9/11. I've said this many times. In the written test alone, I competed against 1,000 certified firefighters and either EMTs or paramedics, and then a lot of them had a fat resume too, from Department of Forestry to explorer programs, ambulance operators, etc., lifeguards. So these were the creme de la creme, and then you're competing against 1,000 of them. My class was 15 people. There was 2 classes, so very, very competitive. But then when you get hired, they traditionally, through attrition, because the bar was set so high, would lose 25% of every class by the end of the year. So now you've got another few that have gone. By the time you make it through that crucible, you certainly have understood the gratitude of the position that you're in, but you've also kind of proven yourself to the rest of the fire department. We used to work out together. We trained all the time. We ate all the time together. And one of my guests, Dina Ali, I'll credit her to saying this, if we just did exactly what you're talking about, we really wouldn't need peer support and some of these other things anymore, because we would just be organically taking care of each other again. Right. So that reverse engineer, I've got experience, which is probably why I'm so, dogmatic with this messaging, because I've lived a great culture in that one department at that one timeline. And I think that's it. So the lower, conversely, one of the worst places I've worked, which I won't name, the bar was in a trench in the ground. And it was the complete polar opposite. Very, very low, brotherhood, sisterhood, camaraderie, operationally very low standards. So the great firefighters in that department were good despite the environment, not because of the environment. And, the recruitment, if they had 5 openings, they might get 7 applicants. So, you're seeing night and day. So there are these organizations that we can look at and say, all right, what did you do back then? How does your, as you said, your pipeline look? What are you doing to create this high level of gratitude and performance in your environment? And then I hope one day that fire department will then look at the healthier work week and address some of the issues that they have too, because they still have issues.
Right.
But I love that idea of imagine your dream culture, your dream fire department. Reverse engineer, what does it look like as far as step 1, 2, and 3 to get to that point? And then, as you said, to then maintain those great men and women's physical health, mental health, performance.
Well, and I think to your point, there is the maintenance piece of this that often gets forgotten, that well-intentioned starts aren't sustained. And so when I am working with my clients, part of what I talk about is what's your ongoing way of fueling this engine? So if you think about, well, what's the role of a leadership consultant? A lot of times it's come in and do a retreat for us. And early in my career, I said, yes, I want to just do a whole bunch of retreats all the time. That's all I want to do is facilitate retreats. And what I came to learn very quickly was that's a nice to have. And that's all it ends up being if all you're doing is a retreat. Now, when I work with my clients and I'm asked to come and do a leadership retreat, the answer is, okay, yes, and what comes before it and what's coming after it? And how do we ensure that whatever is done at the retreat, we've prepared people for, we've connected to what's happened before, we're addressing real challenges. we're also planning, and this is the most important part of it, we are preparing for what's going to come out of the retreat, and how do we continue to feed this engine or this idea or this vision, whatever we've produced, this good feeling, how are we going to feed that to continue and grow it? Because if we don't continue with a sustaining or a maintaining mentality, then it's simply a nice day to have. And it's like throwing water in a colander. That doesn't do any good to anyone. So I think this reverse engineering is critically important, and it's how I work with a lot of my clients. And once you have that vision, it's how do you continually commit to it? So it's, again, not leaving it to chance that, okay, because we did these things and we have this now, we can wash our hands of it. No, it's like maintaining a body's health. You have to continue to do those good sleep hygiene practices. You have to continue to eat nutritious foods. You have to continue to maintain the stress. You will never be in a stress-free environment. Our organizations will always be under threat somehow. The leaders will always feel stress. It's what are our practices for navigating that? How do we mitigate when we can? And what happens when we can't? So when a crisis hits, are we prepared, and what's our recovery process? So it's that notion of we have to not only create, we also have to sustain and maintain.
Absolutely. Well, I want to hit one more topic, then we'll go to some closing questions. But I know, more recently, as you said, you work with some of the school systems. Another entire conversation in itself. I had an educator on, Pasi Sahlberg, who is from Finland, but he lives in Australia and educates around the world on the Finnish school system. And hearing the model there, who are nearly always at the very, very top of the world's education system, and comparing and contrasting it to the standardized system of education that my son, was led through the last, K through 12. Very, very different structures. And, as far as, the health that we're seeing in schools, for example, the breaking down of PE programs, the types of food that is served in our schools, I would argue that the American school system maybe could have the humility to learn from some other systems around the world. But that's just my perspective. So talk to me about, what you're seeing as far as, our school system itself, and then how were you applying leadership to that environment?
So excellent observations. And the good news is, James, there are school systems that are learning from other non-American school systems. I think one of the challenges in the American schooling system is the centralization at the same time as the fracture. So we don't have federal standards for educating up. We have federal compliance rules that I think are more about constraints than about leveraging assets. And I think that's a real problem. And I think we are continuing to see the challenges that are coming about from more states' rights around what does public education look like. My brother is in Great Britain and has been there for 25 years. So he raised his family in the British schooling system. And part of what I've learned from him is how radically different K-12, whatever version of it you want to call it, how radically different it's done when you have a national governing body that is impacting all schools versus our system where our national governing body impacts only some schools and only in certain ways. And then we have states that are adding its different ways of accomplishing this same end of education for all. So I think we have an incredibly fractured system. I think adding to that complicated structure, we then have the different realities of school funding, where you've got, from my experience working in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, it's an urban school district where the funding model in the state of Ohio is based on real estate taxes. Well, if you know anything about economics in the United States, you know that our urban core of whatever city has much less money than our suburban environments. And when our school system is based on real estate, then our urban core, our urban institutions have much less money to work with. And so there's a huge divide in public education in America between and among urban, suburban, and rural. And rural and urban systems have much more in common with each other than a lot of people realize, because there is this tremendous resource constraint. Add to that, one of the things I came to appreciate is the expectation of communities, for the most part, have increased around what a public school system is responsible for. So I can only speak to my firsthand experience in Cleveland, where the community really was anticipating and expecting the public school system to be responsible for not just the education of young people, but their physical and mental health. So healthcare was being expected of schools to accomplish. What were kids going to be doing after school became the responsibility of the school system. Well, that is cross purposes. So you already have a resource constraint. Now we're having to not just take care of kids during the normal school day, but we have to take care of them before school and after school up until dinner time. We certainly have to feed our kids because we're working in an impoverished city. Cleveland is either the poorest or the second poorest child population in the country. So many children in the public school system had to come to school to be fed twice a day. So during the pandemic, when I was at the school district, we were very proud of the fact that we didn't cut any jobs and we did not stop feeding our kids for the year that the school system was shut down.
Amazing.
And that is a point of pride for the leadership of the district, that we figured out a way to continue to provide for food for our families. And by the way, we were providing food for the families, not just the children. And then it became evident that we needed to provide other resources. So how could we get digital access to these families when we emerged out of the pandemic, but we're in an all virtual environment still? We learned during the year, basically, that the school system was shut down, that lots of families didn't have access to what we're doing, communicating via the internet. So we had to work on how do we get families connected. So I think one of the misunderstandings that is pretty common is how much public schools in America are responsible for, and how many restraints and constraints are put on these systems and the system leaders, not to mention the teachers. So I think there is no more stressful position besides being a first responder than being in a school system. Because whether you're a teacher or a principal or a custodian or one of the people working in the system to provide supports, the responsibilities are mounting and the resources are diminishing. And so the gap is increasing between what's needed and what's being provided to meet those needs. And so I think about the passion with which so many people are committing to and choosing to work for public schools. And I can only speak about public schools because I've not been in the private school setting or the charter school setting. But there are a lot of incredibly talented and gifted professionals and people who are choosing to work for public schools because of the important role that public schools play, because they are an anchor institution in most of our communities. And they are operating, I think, on incredibly reduced and limited and continually diminishing resources. So the leadership challenges are just increasing.
When I was speaking to Pasi, in Finland, when they have more impoverished areas, they actually give them more funding. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
common sense really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Areas
That
that are
would make
affluent,
sense.
and
Yes.
usually your people that have, a higher affluence are usually healthier. They have better healthcare. Maybe they actually have access to school, sports programs, et cetera, et cetera. So they bolster the areas that need them rather than chastise them for
Yes.
having lower scores and then take even more funding from them. So
Exactly.
it makes perfect sense to me to do it that way.
I only wish I could figure out a way to get our lawmakers to see that. We have some pretty horrific school funding formulas, and Ohio has, I think the Ohio State Supreme Court has ruled that our school funding formula is unconstitutional for maybe no less than 25 years. And yet, it continues to be the case that this is how schools are funded. So this is when I feel like a child. I just don't understand. Like I want to throw my body down and just pound the ground and throw a tantrum. Like this cannot continue. And yet year after year, it continues. So when our funding formula continues to misappropriate those funds, I go back to how you started, which is the importance of kindness, compassion, and understanding, care and empathy. That extending that to our school employees is so important because they are taking care of our future and they are building our future because those children are our future.
My son has had so many great teachers. And again, I've like the fire, like the police, I have the utmost respect because they are great teachers despite the system that they have to teach in. What I also experienced, so sadly, was what happens when you put a bad person in a leadership position.
Oh, yes.
So we had the Parkland shooting a few years ago, which got everyone knee-jerk and pendulum swinging the other way when it came to anything in the schools. And after it happened to my own child, I uncovered the fact that this one middle school, the principal and the SRO, were sending children to a 72-hour psychiatric hold, in my son's case, just simply for being in tears, on a weekly basis. So I paid almost $100 to pull the police records, hundreds of kids. Now, I can count on one hand how many people I've Baker acted in 14 years as a firefighter paramedic. And of those, these are people who are clearly suicidal. If we don't lock them up into a room, they will end their own life. Mm-hmm. We have to bring them down. And these children, like when my son was there, I watched numerous ones come through. So that's the other side of this. If we don't go back into the why, like you said, which is physically and mentally healthy children that are on an educational route that inspires them to be, whatever the jigsaw puzzle piece in society, then we're missing the point. And if you're turning your head on literally sending children into a 72-hour hold in a furnitureless room where their shoelaces have been taken away, and then in cases where there is someone who's supposed to be there, now they're enduring screaming and God knows what else for 3 days straight, where their parents can visit them for 10 minutes. You think of the mental health. Yeah. I mean, I saw it on my own child.
It's traumatizing.
So this is the danger as well. When we're not holding these decisions and these leaders in the educational space accountable and or the law enforcement people in those educational facilities, the ripple effect and the damage can be innumerable.
Oh, absolutely. And I saw that as well, not in that same way, but similar and different versions of that story that you just told, which is heart-wrenching. And I'm sorry that you've had to experience that. And others are clearly struggling because they had to experience that. That is the true risk of hiring bodies. You said this earlier in the fire service example, like just hiring bodies to have a physical presence is not what we need. And the schools are going through very similar kinds of hiring challenges. The talent recruitment for a number of years when I was at the district meant that we were actually sending people abroad to try and bring talented teachers here because we were having such a hard time filling the pipeline. And interestingly enough, James, there's a connection between what we were talking about earlier with higher education and this situation in our public schools, which is the pipeline of quality teachers is drying up because education is not valued in our society. It's very difficult for lots of public school teachers to live on the wages that their school district is offering them. So their salaries are not sufficient. So our best and brightest are not going into the teaching profession, which means that pipeline of high quality, qualified teachers is drying up. So we're going to very quickly, if not already, see school systems that are facing real shortages in the classroom. We're facing shortages in our school resource officer role, or whatever the school police component is. We're facing tremendous challenges in our bus drivers and in our food service workers. And I would tell you from firsthand experience, not only at our Cleveland system, but at some other systems where I've had the privilege to work with those individuals who are known as the operations side of the house, they are often the most important individuals in the life of a child, because those are the adults who see the children at the beginning of the day, during the day, and at the end of the day. And if we don't have high quality people in those roles, the difference that a bus driver can make, not only in terms of the safe transport of the children, but also in understanding how is this children starting their day? How is this child going home? And if that person is attuned to children, then the difference, they can change a child's life. Same with the school resource officer. And to your point, go to the other end of the spectrum. If those aren't high quality individuals, the damage they can do in children's lives is immeasurable. So it's that talent pipeline is a huge issue in education as well.
Someone told me the other day that healthcare makes up 20% of our GDP in the US. And if you look at some of the programs that we've had, either in the UK or America, that have shown to be incredibly effective when it comes to increasing the wellness, and we'll just stay with our children, because obviously that's really where you're forging healthy adults. In California, there was a program in La Jolla, have I got that right? In one of the high schools in the 60s. It was based on kind of like a Russian philosophy initially, but all the kids did PE, and there were 4 levels, kind of almost like a belt system in martial arts. And they went through it in teams. I'm sure they kind of put them together as similar standards initially, and you could elevate and you could go to the next one, and it was all basically calisthenics. And the top tier, they would be able to be the front cover of any muscle and health magazine. And so they had the fitness all figured out. So if you wanted to be a baseball player or a basketball player, you were already able to do it athletically. You just learned the skill now. And if you just simply wanted to be in chess club and play the clarinet, well, you were still in great shape. Now you look at what Jamie Oliver did in the UK, bringing healthy food back, real food to the schools, and he revolutionized that. If you look in Japan, they not only cook all the school meals from scratch, but the children even clean their own schools. So now you have this ownership of the building. So again, with the humility, there are all these different things. Finland's philosophy, there's all these systems that are already working. And then now if you forge healthier humans and you start making the nation healthier, now you've freed up tax money that's being wasted on chronic illness. And now you can start putting it back into the teachers and the firefighters and the people that we're talking about. So again, it goes back to this false economy. There are solutions that we don't need even more taxpayers' money. We need to be more efficient in the money that's already there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had the opportunity to go to Singapore and do work with a group of teachers on social and emotional intelligence. And there was a governmental mandate that every child from age 5 to, I think, 20 was required to take a course or to have some kind of learning experience in school around emotional intelligence. And at the time, this was just lights out ahead of everyone else. And when I think about the mental health benefits, so this adds to your equation of if we've got Jamie Oliver's example in the UK around healthy foods, and we have the example from Japan around healthy environments that the children are helping to take care of so they have a sense of ownership. We add to it the Singaporean experience of social and emotional learning that's governmentally mandated as part of the curriculum, where we're learning about what is the impact of our emotions on how we know ourselves and how we interact with others. Imagine how much mental health benefit there would be in our schools.
Yep.
When we know the exact opposite is happening right now, where we have children as young as 6 and 7 having suicidal ideation, which is beyond heartbreaking, like inconceivable to me that that would be the case. And yet we've got demonstrable evidence that mental health among youth is declining rapidly.
Yeah, I know the social media side as well, obviously hopefully not that young, but that's a big factor. And it's great seeing Australia and some of these other places making it illegal to have, social media under the age of, I think it's 16. And then these classrooms that are locking away the phones because, our generation, we got to experience pre-phone life and you weren't distracted. You were bored out your mind in a 2-hour math class, but
right.
but you
at
didn't
least
have
you were safe.
Yeah, and you weren't cyberbullied or comparing yourself to some fake reality.
Exactly. Well, happily, there are more and more school districts that are going to the phones not in the classroom policy, that when students walk in the door, before I left the school district, so this has probably been now 4 years ago, there were a couple of our schools where the principal said, yep, we're done. Parents, our children will not have phones on them during the day. And they were the trendsetters. And now there are entire districts throughout the country that are saying, okay, you can have your phone on your way to school and on the way home. But as soon as you walk in the door, that phone goes away. And what's been interesting is I've learned from colleagues, the people who have been the most resistant, besides parents, and for some very good reasons, it's actually been the teachers. The teachers who are very resistant to turning in their phones. Because they're saying, well, it's about the kids, it's not about them. But in fact, it is about the adults as well. So I'm hopeful that we will continue to see that trend.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's get to the closing questions then. The first one I love to ask, is there a book or are there books that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
I love reading. So this is a really hard question for me to answer. With your permission, can I offer one fiction and one that's nonfiction?
Please. Absolutely.
Okay. So the fiction book that I would offer is called The Secret Life of Addie LaRue. Addie LaRue. Yes. Fabulous narrative that transports you to another time and a place and sort of plays with our conception of what does the world mean to us and how do we live a good life. I hope I've got that title right. That's the one challenge with me recommending books is I don't always remember the exact right title. But I think and I'm going to just look at my bookshelf so I don't mess up this title. I think my most recent book that I like talking to people about is by Adam Grant. I'm sure others of your guests have recommended this, but it's one of his newer books, if not the newest one. It's called Think Again. And I think it goes to your question of why are we so resistant to change? And how do we actually help ourselves change our minds? And I just really love how he presents the idea that we can fall into some very natural traps about how we think and how we encourage other people to think. And so I think that's the other book I would recommend.
Brilliant. What about film, television, or documentaries?
Film, television, or documentaries. So I watch to escape. So I'm not going to give you anything that has deep meaning. I feel like my day is filled with enough intellectual and cognitive load that when it comes to watching television and movies, I like to escape. I'm trying to think of, I think the newest series that I have fallen in love with and advocated that people watch is called The Pit, which is all about the life of an ER. You're nodding your head like you know it.
Yep. And then the new season just began. I haven't started it yet.
And then, yep, that's a really great one. And I'm actually restarting Only Murderers in the Building, which is Martin Short and Steve Martin, and I can't remember the actress's name, but that's my other escapism.
Yeah.
Yes, whatever her name is. So those would be my thoughts.
Excellent. All right. Well, is there a person that you recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
Yes, but can I correct the book title, the first one?
Yeah.
It's actually The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue.
Invisible. Okay.
I knew it was invisible. I knew as soon as I said it out loud that I had gotten the adjective wrong.
No problem.
Is there someone who I think you should have on your podcast? Well, yes, actually, the person who comes to mind is my dear friend and co-author, Scott Allen. He is a fantastic, dynamic thinker and speaker around various topics related to leadership. Like you, he has a podcast and has been interviewing people on his podcast since COVID on the topic of leadership. So I think he would have some great perspectives to share with you. And podcaster to podcaster, it could be a fun conversation.
Absolutely. You mentioned co-author. I didn't realize you'd written a book, so tell me about that.
Yes. So Scott and I, along with another colleague, we brought her in the second time around. So we wrote a book called Emotionally Intelligent Leadership, a guide for college students. That was the first edition. We wrote that back in 2008. And then we published a number of resources to go along with that book. So there's a self-assessment, facilitator guide, a student workbook. And then we republished all of those materials 10 years ago now, which is hard to believe. So Emotionally Intelligent Leadership, a guide for students. We were able to get the publisher to get rid of college because our position is this model of leadership applies to all of us, and we're all learning leadership. So it's no longer just about college students. And the book and its resources all focus on the importance of bringing an emotional intelligence lens and perspective into this question of how do I demonstrate leadership. It's learnable, it's teachable, and it's accessible to all of us because we're human beings and we are inherently emotionally intelligent. The question is, are we conscious of how we use ourselves and interact with others in the contexts that we find ourselves? So that's the focus of the book. Easy read, not meant to be a textbook. And in fact, I just gave a copy to a college student who is in our lives. And he said, wait a minute, there are parts of this book where I'm supposed to write in the book. And I said, absolutely. We wanted this to be an interactive experience. So the point of the book is to help the reader explore what dimensions, we call them facets and competencies of emotional intelligence, they can leverage in themselves to better affect change and lead.
And where can people find that book?
On Amazon, actually. Happily available on Amazon. I would just encourage your listeners to make sure they obtain the 2015 version because the 2008 version is still available. And while it was good, the 2015 version is even better. So look for that version.
Brilliant. All right. Well, then the very last question before we make sure people know where to find you. What do you do to decompress?
So I love being outside. I'm still that kid who ran around the neighborhood as much as possible. And so when weather permits, I will go outside. I've learned how to hike in the wintertime because if you love the outdoors and you live in Cleveland, you have to figure out what to do when it snows and is cold. So hiking, cycling, working in my garden, going for long walks, all of those help me decompress, as does, I've recently taken up painting, which has been fascinating because for the majority of my life, I've said I'm not artistic. And I'm learning that actually there is an artist in me. So this is the beginner painter speaking, but I have found that that's a great way to spend time. And then the last way I would say I decompress is I love jigsaw puzzles. So either it's on my iPad or it's literally on a table. There's a jigsaw easily accessible.
Brilliant. Well, for people listening, first, where can they find All American Leadership? And then let's go to anywhere else that they can find you specifically.
Sure. So All American Leadership is online. I think it's actually at allamericanleadership.com. You can find me also. My website is MLS Counsulting, as in my initials, M as in Marcy, L as in Levy, S as in Shankman, mlsconsulting.net. And I'm also on LinkedIn. But as I said to you, I have some challenges with maintaining a social media presence. So I try to post every week, and some weeks are better than others. But those are the two places people can find me online.
Brilliant. Well, I want to thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation. I think the ones I enjoy the most, not that I don't love my conversations with my first responders, but it's when people come from a completely different area and you see these parallels, they exist. And whether it's the moral courage or the altruism or, whatever it is, these same principles apply, because no matter what uniform we're wearing or what profession we're under, we're still human beings. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate you having me. And I just want to extend my thanks to you and my gratitude to all first responders, because generically, I have always appreciated each and every one of you who chooses that path. Through my work with All American Leadership and getting to know those in the fire service, my respect and appreciation has gone up tenfold. So thank you.